The rain came down that night like the city itself was weeping. Carter Williams stood frozen on the bridge railing when he saw her, a woman in an expensive tailored vest, tears streaming silently down her face. Just one more step, and she would disappear into the darkness below. He was a single father with nothing but kindness and a worn jacket. He pulled her back just in time. When the police left, she whispered, trembling but lucid, "Tonight. Could you stay with me?" That was how the strangest night began. Carter Williams was 36 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. 4 years had passed since the accident that took his wife, 4 years of raising their daughter, Louisa, alone. She was 7 now, with her mother's smile and her father's quiet strength. Carter worked the night shift as a delivery driver, loading boxes into a battered van that smelled like diesel and old cardboard. The pay was terrible, but the hours meant he could walk Louisa to school every morning and be there when she came home every afternoon. His apartment was small, the walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing, but it was theirs. He kept it clean. He kept Louisa fed. He kept going because that was what fathers did. Alexandra Sterling lived in a different world entirely. At 34, she was the CEO of Sterling Core, a tech conglomerate that made the news whenever it acquired another company or launched another product. Her office occupied the top floor of a glass tower downtown, all chrome and leather and sweeping views of the city below. She had worked 80-hour weeks to get there, skipping meals and sacrificing sleep, and ignoring the hollow feeling that grew deeper every year. People called her brilliant. They called her ruthless. They did not call her on weekends to see if she was okay. She had money and power and a penthouse apartment that echoed when she walked through it at night. She had everything except a reason to keep going. The bridge stretched across the river on the eastern edge of downtown, its lights casting yellow pools on the wet pavement. Traffic was light at this hour, just the occasional car hissing past on rain-slicked asphalt. Carter had been finishing his last delivery when he heard it, a sound so raw and broken that it cut through the engine noise and the rain. He pulled over without thinking, left the van running with its hazard lights blinking. When he saw her standing on the wrong side of the railing, her knuckles white against the metal, everything else fell away. He did not shout. He did not run. He walked slowly, his shoes squelching in the puddles, until he was close enough to speak in a normal voice. She turned her head slightly, registering his presence but not caring enough to react. Her makeup had run in dark streaks down her cheeks. Her vest was Armani, Carter realized distantly, the kind of thing that cost more than his monthly rent. "Hey," he said quietly. "I'm Carter." She said nothing. "I have a daughter," he continued, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "She's 7. Her name is Louisa. She's waiting for me to come home right now." Alexandra's fingers tightened on the railing. "If I leave you here," Carter said, "I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have changed your mind. And Louisa will grow up knowing her father was the kind of man who walked away when someone needed help." The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the rain and the distant sound of sirens. Then, almost imperceptibly, Alexandra shifted her weight back toward the safe side of the railing. Carter's hand shot out, gripping her arm, and together they climbed back over. She collapsed against the wet pavement, sobbing now in great gasping heaves. Carter sat beside her, his own heart hammering, and waited. The police arrived 7 minutes later, their red and blue lights painting the bridge in urgent colors. They asked questions. They called for an ambulance. Alexandra refused to go. She gave them her name in a flat, exhausted voice and showed them identification that made the younger officer's eyes widen. After 40 minutes of protocols and paperwork and cautious evaluation, they let her go with a crisis counselor's card and a stern warning to call someone. When the taillights of the police car disappeared into the rain, Alexandra turned to Carter. Her voice was barely audible over the downpour. "Will you sleep with me tonight?" Carter's mind went completely blank. He stared at her, certain he had misheard, certain this was some kind of test or trap or breakdown he did not understand. She saw the confusion and shock on his face and shook her head quickly. "I don't mean—" She took a shuddering breath. "I'm not asking for that. I'm asking if you'll stay. In my apartment. Because if I go home alone tonight, I know what happens. I know where my mind goes when the lights are off, and there's no one else there." Carter's first instinct was to refuse. He was a father, He had boundaries. He had Louisa waiting at their neighbor's apartment, probably asleep on Mrs. Henderson's couch with a blanket tucked around her shoulders. But he looked at Alexandra's face, saw the desperation there, and realized this was not about attraction or impropriety. This was about survival. "I need to call my neighbor," he said finally, "to check on my daughter, and I'll stay on the couch. That's the condition." Alexandra nodded, something like relief breaking through her exhausted features. "Yes. Thank you. Yes." The apartment was everything Carter expected, and nothing he could have prepared for. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the glittering city, rain streaming down the glass in rivulets. The furniture was minimalist and expensive, all sharp edges and neutral tones. It felt more like a museum than a home. There were no photographs on the walls, no dishes in the sink, no sign that anyone actually lived here except for a single coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter, the brown ring inside suggesting it had been sitting there for days. Alexandra disappeared into the bedroom and emerged wearing sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, looking more human than she had on the bridge. Carter sat on the leather couch, still damp from the rain, feeling profoundly out of place. She brought him a towel and a glass of water and sat in the armchair across from him, pulling her knees up to her chest. They talked through the night. Not about anything profound at first, just small things, safe things. Carter told her about Louisa's obsession with dinosaurs, how she could name every species in the museum's paleontology wing. Alexandra talked about growing up in Connecticut, her father's expectations, the scholarship that changed everything. The conversation moved slowly, carefully, like two people navigating a minefield. As the hours wore on and exhaustion loosened their guards, the truth began to emerge. Alexandra told him about the board meeting scheduled for Monday morning, about the internal audit that blamed her for a workplace accident that killed a junior engineer 3 months ago, about the emails that proved her CFO and 2 board members had been systematically undermining her authority, positioning themselves to push her out and take control of the company, about how she had spent the last week watching everything she built crumble while the media circled like sharks. "They're making me the villain," she said, her voice hollow. "They altered the safety reports. They backdated emails. They have a replacement CEO already lined up. And there's nothing I can do to prove my innocence because they control the narrative." Carter listened, asking questions but never judging. He told her about the year after his wife died, when grief felt like drowning in slow motion. About the days when getting out of bed felt impossible, but he did it anyway because Louisa needed breakfast. About learning that survival was not about being strong, but about being stubborn enough to take one more breath, make one more choice, live one more day. They did not touch. They did not cross any lines. They simply sat in that expensive empty apartment and reminded each other that they were not alone. When dawn broke over the city, painting the rain clouds in shades of gray and gold, Carter stood to leave. He needed to get home before Louisa woke up. His back ached from sitting upright on the couch all night, and exhaustion pulled at him like an undertow. But it was something else too. A strange lightness, the feeling of having done something that mattered. Alexandra walked him to the door, looking more steady than she had the night before but still fragile, like glass held together by willpower. Her eyes were clearer, though shadows still haunted the edges. She had put on mascara at some point, Carter noticed, and brushed her hair. Small acts of self-care that suggested she was choosing to keep going. "Thank you," she said. "For everything. For not judging me. For staying." Carter nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude for something that had felt so necessary. "Call someone today. A friend? A therapist? Anyone. Don't try to do this alone." She promised she would. Carter did not entirely believe her, but he had done all he could do. As he turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved my life last night. I need you to know that." He met her eyes and saw the truth there, raw and unflinching. "Then live it well," he said simply. Carter rode the elevator down 53 floors and walked out into the early morning streets, where delivery trucks were already rumbling past and coffee shops were opening their doors. The world looked different somehow, sharper, more real, like he had been sleepwalking through the last 4 years and finally woken up. By the time he reached his van, still parked illegally by the bridge, with a parking ticket tucked under the windshield wiper. It felt like the entire night had been a fever dream. But it was not a dream. And it was far from over. Alexandra stood at her window for a long time after Carter left, watching the city wake up. Something had shifted in her during those hours of conversation. The despair had not disappeared, but it had loosened its grip just enough for her to breathe. She picked up her phone and called her assistant, then her lawyer, then a private investigator whose card she had been carrying for weeks. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. But first she needed information. She needed to know who Carter William really was, and whether she had just made a terrible mistake by trusting a stranger. What she found shocked her. The man was exactly who he claimed to be, a delivery driver living paycheck to paycheck in a neighborhood where rent was cheap and crime was common. But the deeper dig revealed something else. Before the accident, before his wife's death, Carter had been a senior data engineer at a consulting firm downtown. He had worked on financial systems, audit protocols, database architecture. He had quit 4 years ago to care for his dying wife and never gone back. Alexandra sat with this information for a long time. Then she picked up the phone again. Carter was making Louisa breakfast when his phone rang. He did not recognize the number but answered anyway, balancing the phone between his shoulder and ear while he flipped pancakes. Mr. Rai? William, this is Elizabeth Chen from Sterling Core. Ms. Dowlings. Sterling would like to meet with you this afternoon to discuss a consulting opportunity. Would 2 o'clock work for your schedule? Carter nearly dropped the spatula. I think there's been a mistake. I'm not, Miss. Sterling was quite insistent. She asked me to tell you it's important. Personal, not professional. Louisa looked up from her coloring book, her eyes curious. Carter covered the phone's microphone and mouthed just work stuff before returning to the call. Against his better judgment, he agreed to meet. The coffee shop Alexandra chose was deliberately neutral, not too expensive, not too cheap, far from both their neighborhoods. She was already there when he arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee growing cold in front of her. She looked different in daylight, more composed but also more vulnerable somehow. The makeup could not quite hide the shadows under her eyes. I had you investigated, she said without preamble. I'm sorry. I needed to know. Carter should have been angry, but he understood. He sat down across from her and waited. You used to work in data engineering, Alexandra continued. Financial systems. Audit compliance. A long time ago. How long would it take you to review a safety audit report and tell me if the data's been manipulated? Carter went very still. Why are you asking me this? Alexandra slid a flash drive across the table. Because I can't trust anyone at my company. Because the people trying to destroy me are professionals and I need someone who understands how these systems work. Because you're the only person I've met in years who doesn't want anything from me. I'm not that person anymore, Carter said. I haven't touched a database in 4 years. But you could. If you wanted to. Carter picked up the flash drive, felt its weight in his palm. This was a terrible idea. This was asking for trouble. He had Louisa to think about. A simple life that worked because he kept his head down and did not get involved in other people's problems. But he remembered Alexandra on that bridge. He remembered the desperation in her voice when she asked him to stay. He remembered his wife telling him, near the end, that the worst thing he could do was stop being the kind of man who helped people. I'll look at it, he said. But I'm not making any promises. The data told a story that made Carter's blood run cold. Someone had systematically altered timestamps, changed approval signatures, and deleted entire audit trails. The manipulation was sophisticated enough that most people would never notice, but Carter had spent years building systems designed to catch exactly this kind of fraud. He worked through the night while Louisa slept, filling a notebook with findings and cross-references and damning conclusions. He called Alexandra at 6 in the morning. You were set up, and I can prove it. But proving it came with a price. By noon that day, someone had leaked photos of Carter and Alexandra entering her apartment building the night of the bridge incident. The caption read, Sterling CEO's mystery man, romance or crisis. By evening, reporters were camped outside Carter's apartment building. Mrs. Henderson called, worried about men with cameras asking questions about Louisa. Carter sat on his couch, head in his hands, while the phone rang and rang. This was what he had feared. This was why he tried to stay invisible. Louisa came out of her bedroom, scared by the commotion, and crawled into his lap. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" "No, sweetheart. We're not in trouble." But he was not entirely sure that was true. Alexandra saw the photos and felt something inside her break open. Not despair this time, but rage. They were using Carter now, dragging him into their web because he had made the mistake of being kind. She could walk away. She could let them have the company, take the settlement they were offering, disappear to Connecticut or California, or anywhere she did not have to see their smug faces. But that would mean Carter had exposed himself for nothing. That would mean they won. She picked up her phone and called her lawyer. "Set up an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Tell them I'm resigning. Tell them I'm going to make a statement." Then she called Carter. "I'm ending this. Tomorrow. But I need you to trust me one more time." The Sterling Core boardroom was designed to intimidate. 20 feet of mahogany table, leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, windows that looked out over the city like a throne room surveying its kingdom. The board members filed in looking smug and satisfied, ready to accept Alexandra's surrender with the appropriate show of reluctance. Richard Voss, the CFO who had orchestrated most of the betrayal, took his seat at the far end of the table. Linda Marsh and Thomas Burke, the board members who had helped him, sat on either side like palace guards. They had rehearsed this moment. They knew exactly how it would go. Alexandra entered last, and she was not alone. Carter followed her, carrying a laptop and a manila folder, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a borrowed suit. The board members exchanged glances. Confusion, amusement, dismissal. "Ms. Royo." Sterling, Richard began with false sympathy. "We appreciate you making this transition as smooth as possible. We've prepared the resignation papers and a generous severance package that—" "I'm not resigning," Alexandra said calmly. "I'm presenting evidence of corporate fraud to this board and filing criminal complaints with the district attorney's office." The room went silent. Richard's expression did not change, but Carter noticed his fingers tighten on his pen. "That's a serious accusation," Linda said carefully. "Do you have proof?" Carter opened the laptop. For the next 45 minutes he walked them through the data. Every altered timestamp, every deleted file, every signature that did not match its supposed author. He spoke in the calm, methodical voice of someone who had done this work 1,000 times before, laying out evidence like stones building an inevitable wall. He showed them the original safety reports, recovered from backup servers they thought had been wiped. He showed them the emails revealing the plan to manipulate stock prices by pushing Alexandra out during the scandal. He showed them everything. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Thomas Burke looked like he might be sick. Linda had gone pale. Richard sat perfectly still, his lawyer's training kicking in even as his world collapsed. "Who are you?" Richard asked Carter finally. "Someone who knows how to read data," Carter replied. "Someone who doesn't work for you. Someone you can't threaten or buy off." The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. Richard, Linda, and Thomas were escorted from the building by security while their lawyers made frantic phone calls. The media that had been so eager to tear Alexandra down suddenly discovered they loved a redemption story. The same reporters who had questioned her competence now praised her strength and resilience. Carter watched it all from the sidelines, relieved when the cameras finally lost interest in him and returned their focus to where it belonged. 3 months later, Alexandra stepped down as CEO Bajo. Not because she was forced out, but because she chose to. She had fought for Sterling Core, not because she loved the company, but because she refused to let them win. Now that she had won, she discovered she did not want to spend the rest of her life in that glass tower, attending meetings and making decisions and coming home to an empty apartment. She sold most of her shares, donated a substantial amount to mental health organizations, and took a year off to figure out what came next. She started therapy. She reconnected with old friends she had neglected during her climb to the top. She learned to sleep without medication and wake up without dread. Carter kept driving his delivery van and raising Louisa and living his quiet life. But it was not quite as lonely anymore. Alexandra called sometimes, just to talk or check in or ask his advice about something she was working on. Sometimes she visited, bringing books for Louisa or groceries that mysteriously appeared in Carter's refrigerator. She never pushed for more than friendship, and Carter appreciated that. They had both learned that the most important connections were built on respect and trust, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations. On Louisa's 8th birthday, Alexandra showed up at their apartment with a gift wrapped in dinosaur paper. Louisa tore it open to reveal a telescope, not an expensive one that would make Carter uncomfortable, but a good quality beginner's model perfect for a curious child. While Louisa set it up by the window, chattering about constellations, Carter and Alexandra stood in the kitchen. "How are you?" he asked. "Better," she said honestly. "Not perfect, but better. That's all any of us can ask for." Alexandra looked at him for a long moment, this man who had saved her life by simply refusing to walk away. "I've been thinking about that night on the bridge, about what you said about your daughter waiting for you." "What about it?" "I used to think I had no one waiting for me. No reason to keep going. But I was wrong." She smiled, and it reached her eyes this time. "I had myself. I just needed to remember she was worth saving too." Carter nodded, understanding in the way that people who have survived their own darkness understand each other. From the living room, Louisa called out, "Daddy!" "Miss Alexandra, come look. I can see the moon." They went to join her, crowding around the telescope, taking turns peering through the eyepiece at that distant, glowing sphere. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, people rushing and struggling and surviving in their own ways. But inside this small apartment, there was warmth and laughter, and the simple miracle of another day. Carter had learned long ago that heroism was not about grand gestures or perfect solutions. It was about showing up, about choosing kindness when you were tired, about believing that one person could make a difference, even if that difference was as small as staying awake through the night so someone did not have to face their demons alone. As he watched Louisa adjust the telescope and Alexandra help her find Jupiter, Carter thought about all the nights since the bridge. Alexandra had kept her promise to seek help. She had found a therapist who specialized in executive burnout and trauma. She had joined a support group for people dealing with depression. She had learned to recognize the warning signs and reach out before the darkness became overwhelming. The road to healing was not straight or simple. There were setbacks and hard days and moments when the old despair crept back in. But Alexandra had built a support system now, not just Carter, but a whole network of people who cared whether she was okay. She had learned that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom. The scandal at Sterling Core had led to major reforms. The new CEO, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who had been on the board but had no part in the conspiracy, implemented strict oversight protocols and whistleblower protections. The company paid a substantial settlement to the family of the engineer who had died, and the safety violations that contributed to the accident were publicly acknowledged and corrected. Richard Voss and his co-conspirators faced criminal charges. The trial was still months away, but their lawyers were already negotiating plea deals. They would not escape justice, even if that justice was slower and more complicated than anyone wanted. Carter had received offers, consulting jobs, speaking engagements, interview requests from news programs that wanted to tell his story. He turned them all down. This was not about becoming famous or cashing in. This was about doing what was right and then going back to his life. He liked his life. He liked walking Louisa to school and knowing his neighbors and coming home to an apartment that was small but safe. He did not need more than that. But he had learned something too. He had spent 4 years in survival mode, focused only on getting through each day and taking care of his daughter. He had forgotten that he had skills and knowledge that could make a difference. He started taking online courses at night after Louisa went to bed, updating his credentials, remembering who he had been before tragedy redefined him. He was not ready to leave delivery driving yet, but he was allowing himself to imagine a future beyond it. Mrs. Henderson, who had watched Louisa that first night and many nights since, told him she was proud of him. The other drivers at the depot, who had heard bits and pieces of the story, treated him with a new respect. Even Louisa, who did not fully understand what had happened, seemed to sense that her father had done something important. The telescope became a fixture in their apartment. On clear nights, Carter and Louisa would take it to the roof of their building and map the stars. Sometimes Alexandra joined them, spreading a blanket on the concrete and lying back to look up at the infinite darkness punctuated by light. Those nights reminded all three of them that they were small and the universe was vast, but that did not make their choices meaningless. If anything, it made them more precious. One evening, 6 months after the bridge, Alexandra arrived at their apartment looking nervous. She had something to tell them, she said. Carter braced himself for bad news, but Alexandra's smile was genuine. I've been offered a teaching position, she explained. At the business school where I got my MBA. They want someone to teach ethics and corporate governance. Someone who has actually faced those challenges in the real world. Are you going to take it? Louisa asked, munching on a cookie. I think so. It pays a fraction of what I used to make. But I think it might be important work. Carter raised his glass of juice in a toast. To new beginnings. They clinked glasses, juice for Louisa, water for the adults, and talked late into the evening about the future and the past and the strange paths that brought people together. When it was time for Louisa to go to bed, she hugged Alexandra goodnight with the easy affection of a child who had claimed another adult as part of her small, safe world. After Louisa was asleep, Carter and Alexandra sat in the quiet living room, the way they had that first night in her penthouse, but with none of the desperation or fear. Can I ask you something? Alexandra said. That night, on the bridge. Why did you stop? You could have kept driving. Most people would have. Carter thought about this. My wife used to say that the measure of a person is what they do when no one is watching. When there's no reward and no recognition. You do it because it's right, or you don't do it at all. She sounds like she was remarkable. She was. She would have liked you. Nee. They sat with that for a moment, honoring the memory of the woman who had shaped Carter into someone who stopped on rainy bridges for strangers. Do you ever wonder how things would be different if that night had gone the other way? Alexandra asked quietly. Every day, Carter admitted. But not in the way you might think. I don't wonder what would have happened if I had driven past. I wonder what would have happened if I had gotten there 5 minutes later. If you had been alone just long enough to make a choice you couldn't take back. Alexandra reached over and squeezed his hand. But you didn't. And I'm still here. And that matters. It does, Carter agreed. They sat together in the small apartment with its worn furniture and second-hand telescope, two people who had saved each other in different ways. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to their survival or suffering. But inside there was light and warmth and the quiet certainty that tomorrow would come and they would face it together. This was not a fairy tale ending. Alexandra still struggled with dark thoughts sometimes. Carter still worried about money and Louisa's future. The world was complicated and often cruel, and there were no guarantees for anyone. But they had learned that reaching out in the darkness could lead to light. That kindness was never wasted. That the bravest thing anyone could do was choose to keep living, even when every instinct screamed to give up. As Alexandra walked to the subway that night, her phone in her pocket contained the crisis hotline number she had memorized, but not deleted. She had learned to carry it like a safety net, a reminder that help was always just a call away. She thought about the teaching position, about the chance to help other people navigate the ethical quicksand of corporate leadership. She thought about Carter and Louisa and the strange family they had accidentally formed. And she thought about the bridge, that rainy night that seemed like a lifetime ago, when a stranger had offered her his hand and refused to let go. Sometimes that was all it took. One person, one choice, one moment of grace in the midst of despair. The ripples spread outward from there, touching lives in ways no one could predict or control. Carter had saved Alexandra. Alexandra had saved Sterling Core's future employees by exposing the corruption. Together, they had shown Louisa that the world could be hard, but also good, that people could be trusted if you chose carefully, that family was something you built, not just something you were born into. The moon was bright that night as Carter stood on the roof with his telescope, Louisa asleep in her bed, and the city spread out below like a field of fallen stars. He thought about all the delivery routes he had driven, all the packages he had carried, all the quiet ways he had survived the years after loss. He thought about the person he used to be, and the person he was becoming. He thought about his daughter, growing up knowing that her father was someone who stopped when others needed help, even when it was inconvenient or risky or terrifying. He adjusted the telescope and found Saturn, its rings sharp and clear in the cold air. Beauty in the darkness, light in the void. Proof that even the smallest things, atoms and choices and moments of courage, could create something extraordinary when they came together in the right way. Carter William did not consider himself a hero. He was just a father doing his best. A man who had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply be present when someone needed you. But on that night on the bridge, in that rain-soaked moment when everything hung in the balance, he had made a choice that changed 2 lives and rippled outward to change many more. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.